Title: This $151 Waterfront skyscraper is collapsing. 133 families forced to evacuate. Visual: dramatic, high-contrast drone footage overlooking a gleaming waterfront skyline in the twilight. The camera fast zooms into a single towing 19-story, concrete luxury high-rise, standing ominously isolated against the shoreline. Text flash on screen: impending catastrophe. Narrator: urgent. Cable News Energy. Breaking news tone: February 2025. It's an ordinary Tuesday evening in one of China's most prestigious eastern coastal hubs. The wealthy residents of the Haijing Pavilion, the tallest, most exclusive historic waterfront residential tower on the city's glittering harbor, receive an emergency alert on their phones. It isn't a typhoon warning. It isn't a fire drill. The message from the Municipal Construction Commission is a blunt, terrifying ultimatum. You have exactly 36 hours to grab what you can carry and run. Visual: fast cuts of archival footage showing chaotic nighttime evacuations. Suitcase being dragged across marble lobbies. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights. Why? Because top-tier structural engineers had finally completed a rigorous, computerized load-bearing analysis of the massive concrete floor slabs beneath the residents' feet, and the mathematical models yielded a horrifying truth. The building was literally crushing itself. The structure was carrying vastly more weight than its degraded engineering joints could safely support. We aren't talking about a slow, predictable lean. We are talking about a catastrophic structural mechanism known to engineers as punching shear. Imagine a heavy concrete slab resting on a solid, vertical column. If the load exceeds the critical capacity, the column doesn't just bend. It punches straight through the floor above it like a sharp pencil piercing a thin sheet of paper. One floor drops onto the next. The combined weight instantly overloads the lower joint, a domino effect traveling at supersonic speeds. 19 stories of luxury real estate collapsing inward, one level at a time. A total structural implosion. To prevent an unprecedented disaster on the eastern seaboard, the local housing bureau didn't wait for a warning sign. They emptied the entire megastructure before the math could turn into reality. Visual, graphic animation of a flat plate concrete tower showing a column punching through a floor slab, causing a chain reaction pancake collapse. Nearly 50 years before that frantic evacuation order was issued, the Haijing Pavilion was the ultimate symbol of coastal prosperity. Erected in the late 1970s during the early waves of regional maritime development, this 19-story reinforced concrete marvel stood proudly at the edge of the harbor. On one side, it faced the wide-open, turbulent waters of the East China Sea. On the other, it looked down upon the low-rise, historic rooftops of the old city center, containing 112 premium condominiums and a cluster of high-end, multi-level townhomes at its base. It was a pioneering vertical community. For decades, it held the undisputed title of the tallest residential building in the entire district. It was an irreplaceable architectural landmark because shortly after its completion, the municipal government enacted strict zoning laws, capping the height of all future waterfront developments to protect the historic skyline. That made the Haijing Pavilion a finite piece of luxury real estate. Keeping it pristine, keeping it standing tall against the harbor winds, was a deep point of pride for the elite families who lived there. But living on the razor's edge of the ocean comes with a quiet, invisible, and highly destructive tax. Visual: close-up shots of rusting rebar, cracking concrete, and salt-crusted structures near the sea. The salty marine air doesn't care about architectural status or real estate values. Over the decades, the relentless moisture and airborne chlorides silently penetrated the building's exterior defenses, migrating deep into the core of the concrete structure. By 2015, the very same panoramic harbor views that had commanded multi-million-dollar premiums were actively destroying the building. Engineers brought in for a routine inspection discovered severe systemic corrosion cutting through the structural integrity of the residential balconies, the exterior shear walls, and the post-tensioned underground parking deck directly beneath the main tower. Huge chunks of degraded concrete, known as spalling, were actively breaking loose, falling from high-altitude balcony edges and crashing down onto the ceiling of the subterranean garage where residents parked their luxury vehicles every single day. The Property Owners Association realized they were sitting on a ticking clock. They immediately engaged specialized structural restoration firms to execute a massive multi-million-dollar remediation project. Crews worked around the clock, rebuilding 191 heavily compromised balconies, structurally reinforcing the underground garage, and installing complex cathodic protection systems, a high-tech method that passes an electrical current through the concrete to arrest the chemical rusting of the steel rebar buried inside. Visual. Fast-paced montage of construction, workers on climbing platforms, scaling the facade of a high-rise tower. They managed to complete this monumental overhaul while the building remained fully occupied, with heavy industrial climbing platforms constantly running up and down the building's facade. But tucked away deep within the structural engineer's technical logs from that 2015 retrofit was a dark, catastrophic detail that almost every single resident missed at the time, while chipping away at the old concrete to repair the ocean-facing balconies. The engineering crews uncovered a structural anomaly that had absolutely nothing to do with salt air or environmental weathering. It was a fatal legacy of the original construction phase. The builders in the late 1970s had placed the internal structural reinforcing steel in completely the wrong position within the forms. The steel rebar was sitting dangerously low in the slabs, meaning these luxury balconies had been severely underdesigned and structurally deficient from the very day the building opened. The 2015 repair crews had to hastily bolt external steel structural supports directly to the underside of the concrete slabs just to bring the balconies up to the bare minimum safety code. It was a screaming warning sign written in rusted iron and fractured concrete. But in the rush to complete the aesthetic facelift, the warning wasn't loud enough. No one stopped to ask the single most terrifying logical question. If the original builders got the engineering of the balconies completely wrong, what else did they fail to build correctly deep inside the core of the tower? Visual. Graphic timeline spanning from 1978 to 2025 appears on screen. The graphic plummets dramatically as the timeline reaches the years 2022 and 2025. Audio effect, heavy industrial clang. Narrator, gravelly, accelerating the pace. The terrifying answer to that question would not come from a scheduled state safety review or a routine municipal audit. It was uncovered entirely by accident. In late 2022, an independent contractor was hired to execute a routine interior renovation of a single privately owned luxury unit deep in the upper levels of the Haijing Pavilion. It was supposed to be standard cosmetic work, tearing down partition walls, upgrading finishes. But the moment the crew demolished the thick interior drywall and exposed the building's core skeleton, the project ground to an immediate halt. There, hidden behind years of high-end paint and wallpaper, was a structural nightmare. The contractor discovered an aggressive, visible gap and severe structural distress at the critical junction where an enormous vertical concrete column met the horizontal floor slab it was engineered to hold up. Visual. Extreme close-up zoom of a failing concrete joint, with animated red overlays hiding stress lines and cracks spreading from tom center. Let's be absolutely clear. This is the one connection in an entire skyscraper where you can never, under any circumstances, afford to find a flaw. In a flat-plate concrete tower, this exact load-bearing joint is the thin line between structural stability and total disaster. It is the solitary structural mechanism that prevents each floor from instantly giving away under the force of gravity and collapsing into the home directly beneath it. You would think a discovery of this magnitude, a structural failure staring a contractor right in the face, would have instantly triggered a high-level emergency intervention by the Municipal Construction Commission. You would think sirens would be blaring. Instead, it triggered a multi-year bureaucratic paper trail. The Property Owners Association, terrified of a plummeting real estate valuation on the open market, sought to handle the crisis internally. They retained a private, third-party structural engineering firm to quietly execute a comprehensive diagnosis of the tower's skeleton. But the engineers immediately hit an insurmountable wall of human resistance. To look closer at the concrete joints meant violently tearing into the living rooms, bedrooms, and pristine ceilings of multi-million yuan luxury apartments. Visual. B-roll of luxury interiors, cut with archival images of jacammers chipping away at Tyndall walls, exposing raw rebar. The structural testing was incredibly intrusive. Heavy core drilling, destructive concrete testing, and ultrasound scanning were required to map out the interior rebar. Dozens of wealthy property owners flatly refused to allow inspectors to demolish their high-end custom interiors just to satisfy a structural hypothesis. Because of this intense pushback, the engineering firm was severely limited. They were only granted physical access to examine a mere 16% of the entire 19-story high-rise. But even through that narrow, highly restricted 16% window, the technical conclusions were profoundly unsettling. The analytical data proved that these structural defects were completely unrelated to the building's age, coastal typhoons, or ocean air degradation. The forensic engineering reports traced the vulnerability directly back to the late 1970s. Built entirely on a foundation of structural shortcuts and original construction malpractice. The internal structural rebar was missing, misaligned, or completely omitted at the critical column heads during the rapid pour cycles of the initial construction phase. The engineering firm issued an urgent technical advisory. They recommended the immediate installation of massive temporary steel shoring posts, heavy industrial columns, designed to manually prop up the weak zones from the inside. However, the firm stopped just short of declaring the tower an immediate active collapse hazard. They didn't officially state it was unsafe for human occupancy. And because that final, ultimate alarm wasn't sounded, the local housing bureau allowed the residents to remain. The critical structural warnings regarding the column-to-slab failures were now a matter of official record. Typed up, signed by engineers, filed away into the archives of the Property Management Office, and completely ignored by the public for years. Visual, fast text scrolls across the screen. Excerpts from real technical architectural reports, highlighting the praise deficient bulk resistance in bold red. If you have ever sat through a chaotic property owners association meeting in a high-rise complex, watching representatives argue over minor landscaping budgets, while completely ignoring the underlying engineering of the massive concrete tower they are legally responsible for, this cover-up is going to feel deeply familiar. If you want more exhaustive breakdowns of how luxury mega-projects and iconic high-rises are structurally failing from the inside out across major global hubs, you are watching the right channel. Smash that subscribe button right now, hit the notification bell, and let's keep going. Because by early 2025, the luxury facade completely dissolved. Realizing the extreme legal liability hanging over their heads, a second, far more aggressive, an internationally certified structural forensic engineering firm was brought in to finish the comprehensive analysis that the first firm could not. This time, there were no compromises, no half measures. Backed by stricter regulatory mandates, following recent domestic high-rise safety crackdowns, this new team forced their way through the building, mapping out the structural matrix of the floors using advanced ground-penetrating radar and three-dimensional structural stress mapping. What they found turned a slow-burning, hidden anxiety into an absolute state-level emergency. On February 25, 2025, the engineering firm bypassed the property board entirely and delivered a blunt, terrifying letter straight to the Municipal Housing Bureau and the local government. The technical conclusion was absolute, stripped of all diplomatic engineering jargon. The document stated unequivocally, "The Haijing Pavilion is no longer structurally safe for human habitation. Total structural evacuation must be executed immediately." Visual, high-speed computer rendering showing the stress load increasing on a flat concrete slab until the graph turns solid crimson, followed by an image of the Waterfront Tower, surrounded by red warning lines. Pay very close attention to this next part, because it reveals the underlying structural flaw threatening an entire generation of high-rise construction. The Haijing Pavilion was engineered using a structural blueprint known as a flat-plate concrete system. In a standard building, the heavy concrete floors rest on a network of thick horizontal steel beams, which distribute the massive weight safely outward to the vertical support columns. But in a flat plate system, there are no beams. The floors are designed as completely flat, uniform slabs of concrete resting directly on top of the vertical columns. Much like a thin sheet of glass balanced on the tips of upright pool cues during the construction boom era. Developers absolutely love this system. It is incredibly cheap, it cuts down on materials, it allows floors to be poured at lightning speed, and it maximizes the vertical clearance inside the apartments, allowing developers to squeeze more floors into a single tower. When designed to flawless mathematical tolerances and packed with dense, internal steel reinforcement, a flat plate system works perfectly. But the fatal flaw of this entire design is concentrated entirely at the exact point of contact, the precise square centimeters where the vertical column meets the flat underside of the concrete slab. If you place too much weight anywhere on that floor, or if the original construction crews misplace the internal steel reinforcement by even a few centimeters, the localized pressure at that joint skyrockets to catastrophic levels. The column will punch straight through the concrete floor above it, like a heavy iron spike driving through a cardboard box. The industry term for this sudden, violent structural failure is punching shear, and the newly deployed 2025 engineering report had just proved that the Haijing Pavilion's concrete floor slabs were currently sitting right at 100% of their critical punching shear capacity. The tower was under so much stress that it was on the verge of failure, not from a massive earthquake, and not from a violent coastal storm, but simply from the ordinary, dead weight of the people, the marble countertops, and the luxury furniture sitting inside the apartments. Visual, dramatic reenactment senior. The screen splits into a grid of multiple monitors showing monitoring, condometers with structural stress sensors spiking into the red zone. Narrator, tone dropping to an intense, whispered urgency. And then, the engineering data got even worse. The structural investigators could confirm this terrifying punching shear crisis in the specific 16% of the high-rise they had physically mapped out. But they issued a dark, sweeping warning to the municipal authorities. The remaining 84% of the tower, locations they had been completely unable to reach due to locked doors and non-compliant property owners, were highly likely to be just as structurally deficient. There was no way for the local housing bureau to point at 3 or 4 specific luxury units and say, "The danger lives here, we can just reinforce these rooms." The structural cancer was systemic. The danger was potentially everywhere, woven directly into the hidden concrete skeleton of a building where over 200 people were sleeping every single night. Visual, high-tech, computer design. Animation of the Haijing Pavilion. The graphic cuts the tower in half to reveal a rentional simulation of structural collapse, accompanied by the loud, hollow sound of cracking stone. If just one of those compromised slab and column joints let go, the structural failure would not stay contained to a single room or a single apartment. Because there were no horizontal structural beams to transfer and redistribute the massive load, the failure of one floor joint would trigger an instantaneous, uncontrollable chain reaction. One concrete slab would punch straight down onto the floor beneath it, instantly doubling the weight, overloading the next weak joint, and driving it downward through the next level, all the way to the bedrock foundation. The forensic structural engineers used a specific engineering term in their final emergency letter to describe this nightmare scenario, a term that should make the stomach of any high-rise resident completely drop. Progressive implosion. 19 levels of heavy reinforced concrete, pancaking downward, one level at a time, in a matter of seconds. That is not a sensationalized headline. That is not a horror movie exaggeration designed to scare viewers for clicks. That is the exact, documented failure mechanism explicitly spelled out in the official engineering report that landed on the desks of the Municipal Construction Commission. Visual. The screen flashes red with the word critical risk. Fast cuts show similar high-rise concrete investigations taking place across developed metropolitan waterfronts. This structural crisis at the Haijing Pavilion is not an isolated, freak accident. To truly understand the terrifying scale of what we are looking at, you have to realize that this tower is a symptom of a much larger, systemic engineering vulnerability across the country's older modern real estate sectors. Top-tier structural engineering specialists inspecting these types of structural failures have called this case a single, glaring example of a nationwide structural epidemic across major first-tier and second-tier hubs. From the older maritime districts of Shanghai and Tianjin to the rapidly built early economic zones of Shenzhen and Guangzhou, there are thousands of flat-plate concrete high-rises built using this exact same structural blueprint. Thousands of towers sharing the exact same hidden weak link at the slab and column joint. Most of these towers went up during the massive, unbridled urban migration booms between the late 1960s, the 1970s, and the early 1990s. This was an era when the flat-plate concrete design was incredibly popular among regional construction teams because it was the fastest way to erect a vertical concrete jungle. It allowed city skylines to expand rapidly to meet skyrocketing population demands. The problem? The municipal building codes and structural oversight protocols of that era had not yet caught up to what modern forensic engineers now understand about long-term concrete stress and localized shear forces. Visual. Side-by-side graphic contrasting an early flat plate cross-section, thin lacking steel reinforcement, with a modern adjusted building code cross-section, tick reinforced with drop panis and shear studs. Even worse. Many of these coastal megaprojects were severely underdesigned and built using massive structural shortcuts, even by the lower engineering standards of their own time. When developers are rushing to meet tight state deadlines or maximize immediate profit margins during a regional property boom, the precise placement of internal steel rebar inside a quick-setting concrete pour is often the first thing that gets compromised by under-regulated subcontractors. And as structural engineering experts point out, punching shear is completely unforgiving, unlike a classic steel frame skyscraper or a traditional brick-and-mortar structure. A flat-plate concrete joint, suffering from severe punching shear distress, does not give you a long theatrical warning. It doesn't creak loudly for months, it doesn't bow visibly to the naked eye, and it doesn't give residents plenty of time to clear out. The concrete joint looks perfectly solid, holding its massive load right up until the exact microsecond it completely shears through and fails entirely without warning. Visual drone shot of the Apinal Waterfront Tower in the fog. Surrounded by brand new, gleaming glass megatowers comprise the modern harbor skyline. So when you look at the dark, silent windows of the Haijing Pavilion standing over the harbor today, you are not looking at one unlucky, poorly maintained building on a random waterfront. You are looking at a grim, architectural preview of what is coming for hundreds of aging, early-generation concrete luxury high-rises across the nation. It was the ultimate convergence of an engineering storm, severe ocean salt air exposure, decades of deferred structural maintenance by an underfunded property owner's board, a complete lack of transparent structural oversight, and fatal structural shortcuts taken by the original 1970s builders. All of these factors silently met in one place, deep inside the concrete joints of this iconic harbor landmark. The terrifying result? More than 200 wealthy citizens were given just 36 hours to completely abandon their homes, facing a catastrophic structural repair bill that absolutely nobody could afford to pay. The 19-story tower is still standing today for exactly one reason, and one reason only. It is completely empty. The local housing bureau and municipal engineers realized that the only definitive way to keep the Haijing Pavilion from triggering a progressive, catastrophic implosion was to make absolutely sure there was not a single human being inside the building when the joints finally gave way. Visual, heavy industrial cranes and emergency shoring, trucks arriving at the base of the tower. The screen flays text, the civilian cost. Filmed from the ground, we see aging up close to details of the Haijing Pavilion facade. Narrator, urgent, deepening the dramatic emotion. Because a catastrophic structural failure of this magnitude can never be resolved through simple engineering formulas. The immediate real-world intervention wasn't about adding construction materials. It was about rapid, ruthless subtraction. The structural engineering teams calculated that the fastest, most effective way to immediately reduce the critical punching shear stress on those overloaded, failing concrete floor slabs was to strip every single ounce of variable weight out of the tower. In structural engineering, the heaviest, most unpredictable variable load in a residential skyscraper isn't the concrete itself. It's the people, their personal belongings, and the massive array of heavy luxury furniture they install inside their homes. On February 26, 2025, the local housing bureau issued its final, non-negotiable emergency decree. Every resident had to be permanently evacuated by 5 p.m. on February 28th, a day and a half to vacate a lifetime of memories. Visual nighttime footage of elderly residents disoriented on the streets, clutching small bags, with police line tape stretched across the marble entrance of the Haijing Pavilion. The evacuation parameters were severe, bordering on surreal. The municipal safety officials informed the property owners that while they could take their immediate clothing, essential papers, and whatever perishable food was inside their refrigerators, all heavy furniture had to be completely abandoned inside the units. Why? Because moving heavy wardrobes, solid oak tapefields, and massive stone countertops down the hallways would create localized kinetic shifting loads that could cross the razor-thin failure threshold of the floor slabs. The luxury furniture that residents had spent millions of yuan to import was now officially classified as a threat to the structural integrity of the high-rise. The emergency order didn't stop at the tower's 19 stories. The cluster of multi-level townhomes built directly at the base of the tower and the expansive shared underground parking deck were also ordered to be immediately emptied. The Municipal Construction Commission feared that if a progressive punching shear failure triggered a vertical collapse of the main high-rise tower, the immense kinetic force of thousands of tons of falling concrete would punch right through the surface levels and bring the entire subterranean garage down with it, crushing anyone underneath. In an instant, more than 200 residents, occupying a building that had maintained a 60% to 70% occupancy rate for decades, were turned into high-rise refugees. Visual, brief interview clips with text labels for fictional witnesses. Wong floors recently renovated. MS. Lie, reddered compatriot. For the people who called the Haijing Pavilion home, this wasn't just a disruption. It was the total annihilation of their life plans. Consider the story of Mr. Wang, a retired maritime logistics executive who had purchased his premium 15th floor unit just 3 years prior for over 6.5 million yuan. He had poured his entire life savings into securing this specific harbor view, planning to spend his golden years watching the mega container ships glide across the eastern horizon. Now, he was standing on the asphalt outside, watching municipal workers bolt heavy iron chains across the entrance of his building. And then came the financial reckoning. The bill to actually save the Haijing Pavilion from the wrecking ball. Visual. Architectural schematics flashing massive numbers. A digital counter rapidly spins upward, stopping accuratively at 151,100 billion yuan, the comprehensive forensic engineering estimate to structurally stabilize the tower. Retrofit every single one of the thousands of compromised slab and column joints, handle extensive asbestos and toxic material abatement, and perform non-destructive structural stress testing came out to a staggering, eye-watering $151 million, or over 1.1 billion Chinese yuan. When you break that astronomical figure down across the 112 luxury condominiums and the small cluster of baseline townhomes, individual property owners were hit with mandatory emergency assessments that easily topped $1 million to $15 million per family. That translates to anywhere from 7 million to over 10 million yuan per household, just to pay for structural repairs on a building they weren't even allowed to step inside. That is the kind of mathematical disaster that makes even the most seasoned real estate accountants stare in absolute disbelief. On top of those crippling millions, displaced families were suddenly forced to pay up to 35,000 yuan a month out of pocket just to rent equivalent temporary housing in the ultra-expensive Waterfront district while they waited for a legal solution that might take a decade to materialize. Visual. A graphic chart illustrating the debt trap market value of condos vs. maintenance and structural repair cost. The repair cost surpasses the total value. If this were a standard building issue, property owners may have leaned heavily on their commercial high-rise property insurance policies to absorb the shock. But the insurance payouts never arrived. The comprehensive structural coverage that the Property Owners Association had faithfully paid into for decades contained strict, ironclad clauses regarding original construction defects and long-term deferred maintenance. Because the forensic engineering data pointed directly back to the original construction shortcuts taken in the late 1970s and the buried warning signs ignored in 2015. The commercial insurance cartels flatly denied every single claim. The entire 1.1 billion yuan bill dropped squarely onto the shoulders of the individual residents, with absolutely no municipal safety net or state insurance fund underneath them for a massive percentage of the aging owners. The individual assessment to fix the structural concrete joints was actually going to cost vastly more than their luxury apartments had ever been worth on the open market. Think about the agonizing, ruinous choice that creates for a family. Do you sign away your remaining life savings, taking out massive, high-interest emergency lines of credit to pay for the repair of a structural concrete skeleton you've already been forcibly evacuated from? Do you try to sell your compromised deed at a catastrophic fire sale price to speculative distress buyers, if you can even find anyone insane enough to buy into failing flat-plate high-rise? Or do you simply walk away from everything you've ever built, defaulting on your property loans and letting the bank seize a hollow, collapsing shell of concrete? Visual, retrospective montage of life inside the Haijing Pavilion over the decades. Old photographs of residents sharing meals. Neighborhood gatherings in the Waterfront courtyard. The devastating damage to the community went far deeper than pure financial ruin. Prominent legal teams representing the displaced residents described the humanitarian harm as completely irreparable, meaning it was a loss that went far beyond any monetary compensation a court could award. A significant portion of the residents living in this historic harbor tower were elderly citizens who had grown old together inside these walls. Over the span of nearly half a century, they had meticulously constructed quiet, vital, and deeply interdependent social support networks. It was the neighbor on the 8th floor who knocked on an elderly widow's door every single morning to ensure she was healthy. It was the lifelong friend 2 floors up who drove neighbors to their medical appointments at the city hospital every week in a brutal 36-hour window. That entire delicate, irreplaceable vertical village was violently fractured and scattered across the sprawling outer suburbs of the metropolis. You can write down a precise corporate dollar figure for the cost of structural concrete and high-tensile steel rebar. You can never put a price tag on the sudden, permanent destruction of a human community. Naturally, as the initial shock transformed into burning rage, the residents began demanding to know exactly how an elite waterfront community could have been allowed to decay to the point of structural failure right under the nose of the municipal housing regulators. And the lawyers weren't far behind. Visual, heavy gates locking with chans at the Haijing Pavilion compound. The screen flashed text, the ultimate reckoning. Close-up shots of legal briefs and court. Documents stacked onto lawyer's desk. Narrator, delivering the finale with high intensity. As the locks clicked shut on the empty high-rise, a furious wave of litigation erupted across the municipal court system. At least one prominent property owner launched a major lawsuit against the Property Owners Association Board, alleging systemic negligence and a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty. The legal filings claimed that the inner circle, running the building's property management team, had known about the critical slab and column degradation long before that sudden 2025 evacuation order, but intentionally downplayed the data to prevent a panic selling wave that would destroy their luxury property values. Simultaneously, top-tier domestic corporate law firms initiated a massive class action investigation. They set out to determine whether decades of cheap, short-sighted maintenance fixes by shifting property management groups had directly accelerated the structural failure. Visual, animated timeline, highlighting the years 2015, 2022, and 2025 in flashing red bars. Remember, the paper trail of structural warnings didn't appear overnight. It ran all the way back to severely deficient balcony reinforcement found during the 2015 facade overhaul, and the glaring column-to-slab structural gap exposed by a private contractor back in 2022. For 10 solid years, the building was screaming for help. This disaster did not arrive out of nowhere. It was written in the concrete, layer by layer, year after year. Meanwhile, the residents of the multi-level baseline townhomes took a completely different legal path. They bypassed the internal board feuds and filed a major lawsuit against the municipal government. They argued that the emergency evacuation order completely trampled their property rights, giving them zero formal written warning, no administrative hearing, and absolutely no opportunity to present counter-engineering evidence before they were driven from their homes. The townhome owners fiercely disputed the structural models used by the city's second engineering firm. Their independent structural legal team argued that the low-rise townhomes were structurally independent structures, not genuinely tied to the 19-story tower in a way that justified an emergency displacement. Furthermore, they asserted there was zero physical evidence proving that a punching shear collapse within the main tower would automatically pull down the entire shared parking garage. Whether their structural defense holds up in court is a matter for the judicial system to decide, but it reveals a total collapse of public trust. When the very citizens the city is trying to protect end up suing the local housing bureau to get back inside a failing building, the breakdown of structural authority is complete. Visual. Montage of archival newspaper headlines and leaked rear view. Schematics of urban concreted developments. But underneath the legal crossfire was a much deeper, far more human grievance. The residents felt completely betrayed by the people meant to protect them. Multiple property owners told local media outlets that they learned the most terrifying truths about their own homes from late-night television broadcasts and leaked municipal documents, rather than straight answers from their own property board. A prominent regional investigative newspaper later reported that reconstructing the true engineering timeline of the Haijing Pavilion required compiling thousands of pages of restricted structural audits, pieced together through meticulous information requests. For a luxury skyscraper whose central fatal flaw was hidden deep within the dark concrete slabs, there is a bitter, profound irony in how much of the official paperwork stayed hidden from the public eye for years. Visual, slow drone camera reversion. Backing away from the silent waterfront tower, the camera sweeps wide to show hundreds of similar flat-plate, concrete, high-rises, repeated across the urban horizon as far as the eye can see. But the true story here isn't just about one luxury tower failing on a single Chinese waterfront. The Haijing Pavilion is not an architectural anomaly or a freak accident. Top structural forensic experts examining this building have issued a chilling warning. They call this tower a single visible symptom of a hidden, silent structural epidemic. Across the fast-growing coastal and inland metropolises of the region, there are thousands of early-generation, flat-plate concrete developments built during the massive, under-regulated urban transformation waves of the late 20th century. Most of them share the exact same structural weak point at the slab and column joint. Thousands of residential high-rises were under-designed even by the structural engineering metrics of their own time, poured by hurried subcontractors rushing to hit rapid completion targets. And as the data shows, punching shear is a silent, ruthless executioner. It does not offer a long theatrical warning. The concrete joint holds its immense crushing load with absolute rigidity, right up until the exact microsecond it doesn't. When you look at the dark, hollow shell of the Haijing Pavilion standing over the harbor tonight, you aren't looking at an isolated property failure. You are looking at an engineering preview of the future. Marine salt air, decades of deferred building maintenance, underfunded management boards, and original construction shortcuts all met in one catastrophic intersection. Today, that iconic 19-story tower stands completely silent for one reason, and one reason only: it is empty. The single way engineers could prevent it from collapsing under its own weight was to make sure no one was inside when the joints finally gave out. And somewhere out there, hidden in plain sight across a skyline near you, are thousands more towers built the exact same way, with the exact same structural vulnerability, still packed with thousands of families who have absolutely no idea what is sitting directly beneath their feet. If you want to know which major real estate mega projects and aging skyscrapers are quietly failing, long before they ever hit the evening news, make sure to subscribe to this channel and stay with us. We will keep digging